The sun beat down hard on the cracked ground of the southern town of Rose Hill, Tennessee. It was the kind of heat that made dust stick to your throat and time move slower. The war had ended 3 years ago, but in some corners of the South, the ghosts of the Confederacy still whispered in back rooms, and justice walked with a limp. Despite the Emancipation Proclamation and the constitutional amendments, not every soul had embraced the end of slavery. Some still clung to old ways, bending the law in the name of tradition or property disputes. That's how, on that particular afternoon, a child barely old enough to crawl ended up on a raised wooden platform in the center of the town square, auctioned like cattle, as if the world hadn't changed. She was dark-skinned, swaddled in a rag that didn't cover her properly. Her eyes were too big for her face, and she didn't cry. That was what struck people most, the silence. She just looked out at the crowd with a kind of confused innocence, like she hadn't yet decided if the world was cruel or kind. The auctioneer, a thick-bellied man named Brewster, was clearly uncomfortable, but greed dulled his shame. He wiped sweat from his brow, cleared his throat, and shouted, "Infant girl, strong lungs, no known illness, start and bid at $10. His voice rang out across the square, met not with chaos but with a heavy, shameful silence. Some turned away, others stared down at their shoes. A few whispered to each other, but no one raised a hand. From the edge of the square, Thomas Rourke stood watching. He was a tall, gaunt man in a wide-brimmed hat, with sun-scarred skin and a stare like weathered stone. Folks knew him as the loner rancher kept to himself on his land outside of town. Never married again after losing his wife and child during the war. He rarely came into town unless he had to. But today, he stood at the edge of the gathering, arms folded, mouth set in a straight, unreadable line. Brewster spotted him and called out, "Mr. Rourke, good man, kind soul. You could use a helping hand on that ranch, couldn't you? Girl like this, she won't be nothin' but quiet company, maybe a future servant." The crowd slowly turned toward Thomas. His name, spoken aloud, seemed to shift the weight of the moment onto his shoulders. All eyes on the man who had nothing, wanted nothing, and owed nothing. He stepped forward, walking with a slow, deliberate gait until he stood at the foot of the auction block. The child looked at him with wide, curious eyes. For a moment, the entire town square seemed to hold its breath. Thomas looked up at Brewster, then down at the girl, then back at the crowd. "No," he said simply. The word fell like a stone into water, sharp, final, echoing no. Brewster asked, confused. "I'm not bidding. Not today. Not ever," Thomas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "She's not livestock. She's not for sale." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone coughed. A woman gasped. A boy standing behind his father's legs whispered, "Why not?" Brewster tried to laugh it off. "Just a bit of business, Rourke. No harm meant. No one's gonna," but Thomas was already walking away. His boots crunched in the gravel, each step louder than the one before. He didn't look back. That moment, that quiet refusal split the air more cleanly than any bullet, because it wasn't just what he said, it was what it meant. In a town that had grown used to silence, to complicity, to looking the other way, Thomas Rourke had said something with a word and a walk. That girl wasn't his problem. She wasn't his kin. He could have ignored it all, but he didn't, and for reasons no one could quite explain. His refusal shook something deep inside everyone who had been there that day, especially those who wished he had stayed silent. Thomas Rourke had lived alone for nearly 8 years. His ranch lay just west of Rose Hill, where the land stretched wide and open, kissed by sun in summer and clawed by wind in winter. The wooden house he built with his own hands stood atop a rise, modest but solid, with a wraparound porch that looked down over the pasture. There were no neighbors close enough to see his chimney smoke, and that's the way he preferred it. Once Thomas hadn't been a man of silence and solitude. He'd laughed easily, danced on Saturday nights, and worked the fields with a whistle on his lips. He'd had a wife named Elise, soft-spoken but strong, with eyes that seemed to know every secret the world held. They had a daughter, Sarah, who had barely turned 3 when the war came knocking. And like so many others, Thomas answered the call. He left his small family behind, believing the war would be short, believing freedom was worth fighting for, and believing, most of all, that he'd come home to them. But war doesn't just take from soldiers, it takes from those left behind. While Thomas marched through blood-soaked fields in Tennessee and Georgia, fever swept through Rose Hill. His wife wrote one final letter, but it never reached him. By the time he returned, uniform hanging loose on his bones, Elise and Sarah were buried beneath the cottonwood tree behind the house. No one had even carved proper headstones. Just 2 wooden crosses, leaning into the wind. After that, something inside Thomas Rourke simply went quiet. He didn't shout or drink or curse God. He just stopped. He stopped speaking more than he had to. He stopped looking folks in the eye. He stopped expecting anything from the world except the rising sun and the ache in his knees. The ranch became his penance and his sanctuary. He worked it alone, sowed oats, raised a few cattle, chopped wood, hauled water. His hands stayed busy so his mind wouldn't wander. The barn was kept in perfect order, the fences patched at the first sign of wear. At night, he'd sit by the fire, staring at the 2 wooden crosses out the window until the flames died down. Most in town called him cold, or strange. A few called him broken, but none truly understood. How could they? They hadn't lost everything. They'd gone to war to protect. Still, every so often, Thomas would ride into Rose Hill to buy supplies, flour, nails, new boots. When his war through, he never lingered, just nodded, paid in coin, and left. Folks grew used to it. He was like a ghost passing through, present but never fully there. But underneath that hardened exterior, beneath the solitude and silence, Thomas was still watching, still listening. He saw the bitterness clinging to the South like smoke from an old fire. He saw the children of freed slaves being mistreated in the back alleys. He saw men in gray coats spit when they passed black families on the road. And he saw how the town tried to pretend it wasn't happening, how people chose comfort over conscience. He never said a word, but it ate at him. And so, when he saw that baby girl on the auction block, skin dark as riverstone, arms to thin eyes, too wide, something in him cracked. It wasn't just about that child. It was about all the children he hadn't been there to protect. About his own daughter buried beneath the cottonwood. About how easy it was for a town to treat a life like a burden, a product, a thing. And for all his silence, Thomas wasn't the kind of man to pretend a baby didn't matter. That's why he said no. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. He couldn't take her home. Not yet. That road was too steep, too raw. But he could take a stand, a quiet, simple stand that told the world, this is wrong. I will not be part of it. And sometimes, the loudest thing a man can do is walk away. By the time the sun began to dip below the rooftops of Rose Hill, word of Thomas Rourke's refusal had spread far beyond the auction square. It traveled on whispers through the general store, across the porch of the boarding house, and into the dim corners of the saloon. Folks said it in all kinds of tones, some with admiration, others with confusion, a few with quiet scorn. But no matter how they said it, everyone agreed. Thomas Rourke had done something that no one else dared. For a town that prided itself on keeping its head down and its hands clean, his act stirred uncomfortable thoughts. Rose Hill wasn't a place for open confrontation anymore. The war had ended, yes, but many wounds remained raw beneath polite words and Sunday prayers. Former slaveholders still lived in fine houses, and freedmen worked under new contracts that weren't much different than the chains they had escaped. No one talked about it out loud, but injustice still walked their streets slower, quieter, dressed in paper laws instead of iron shackles. So when a man like Rourke, a veteran, a white landowner, a respected rancher, stood up and said no, it sent ripples far wider than anyone expected. At the general store, old Miss Edith, who sold calico and sugar by the pound, told her customers that what Rourke did was unnatural. She shook her head as she handed out change. A man, don't interfere in such matters unless he's looking to cause trouble, she muttered. That baby wasn't his concern. At the blacksmith's forge, however, young Marcus Samuels, whose parents had once worked the land as slaves, whispered to his brother with a new kind of fire in his chest. You hear what he did? He said no, just like that. Didn't even flinch. For the first time, Marcus felt a flicker of hope that someone with power might use it differently. At the saloon, Confederate veterans huddled at the back table played cards and tried to make light of it. Rourke's gone soft, one said, slamming his mug down. A real man wouldn't hesitate. Baby like that could have been raised up to work. Least she wouldn't starve. They laughed, but their jokes were tight-lipped and bitter. Deep down, they knew something was shifting. The preacher, Reverend Baines, didn't say anything. He just stared a long time at the dusty window of his chapel and wondered why his own voice hadn't spoken louder when it mattered. That evening, Brewster, the auctioneer, sat alone in his office. He'd been part of many shady deals over the years, but something about the way Thomas had looked at him stuck like a thorn in his thoughts. There had been no anger in the man's face, disappointment, and that, somehow, was worse. For all his greed and bluster, Brewster had grandchildren, and that baby girl's eyes had reminded him of his youngest, wide and wondering, and too innocent for such a cruel world. The infant, unnamed and untouched by love, had been taken away by a man named Harlan Pita, local overseer with a reputation for taking in strays only when he needed help around his property. No one asked what would happen to her. No one offered to step in. Everyone just watched. Back at the edge of town, in a small cabin behind the bakery, an elderly freedwoman named Alma folded laundry as her niece wept quietly over the story. He didn't take her, the girl cried. He left her there. Alma shook her head. No, child, he didn't buy her. That's a different kind of strength, but she's still alone. For now, Alma said, her voice low, but the Lord sees all. And so do folks with hearts still working. Meanwhile, Thomas Rourke sat on his porch as the sun bled orange across the sky. He didn't light a lantern, he didn't speak. He simply stared out toward the road, unsure if he had done the right thing, or if simply walking away had been another kind of failure. That child's face lingered in his memory like the scent of smoke. Long after the fire's gone, what he didn't know was that someone had followed him home. Someone who had watched from the shadows. Someone who carried the story to people who still believed that mercy had meaning and that sometimes a man's refusal could start something larger than himself. Long after the sun dipped below the horizon and Rose Hill folded into the hush of night, Thomas Rourke remained seated on his porch. The rocking chair beneath him creaked faintly, pushed by his boot heel in slow rhythm. He held a tin cup of cold coffee, untouched since dusk, and watched as the stars began to scatter across the night sky. The land around him was still, save for the occasional howl of a coyote or the rustle of dry leaves blown by the warm summer wind. It was a peaceful kind of loneliness, familiar and constant. But somewhere, in the distance, beyond the fences and past the edge of the creek bed, that peace was beginning to shift. That it began with a sound, barely perceptible. The faint crush of hooves against dry earth. Slow at first, measured, then more multiple, heavy, coordinated. Thomas sat up straight in his chair, setting his cup down on the rail beside him. He listened. A lifetime on the prairie had taught him to hear things others missed. The way cattle moved when spooked. The different whistle of a storm wind. The rhythm of men on horseback when they weren't in a hurry but were coming with purpose. He stood, hand reaching instinctively for the rifle that leaned against the wall beside the front door. He didn't load it. Not yet. Just held it loosely, watching the moonlight bathe the dirt road leading toward his ranch gate. And then he saw them dot at first, only shadows. Figures on horseback emerging like smoke from the tree line. One, then three, then more. Dozens. They didn't shout. They didn't gallop. They approached with solemn, deliberate movement. Riders cloaked and quiet, some with torches raised high, the flames flickering orange and gold against the endless dark. Their faces were grim, resolute, men and women, both. A few had children riding double behind them, holding tight around waists. All of them were black. And all of them rode with a calmness that was somehow more unsettling than rage. Thomas didn't move. He didn't call out. He simply watched as the first wave of riders reached the wooden gate at the edge of his property. 50 at least, maybe more. They didn't enter. They dismounted and stood, shoulder to shoulder, faces lifted toward the porch where he stood. An older man stepped forward. His back was straight, his coat worn but neat, and in his hands he held something wrapped in linen. His voice, when it rose, was clear and steady. "Mr. Rourke," he called, "we come in peace." Thomas stepped off the porch, his boots crunching gravel. He didn't raise the rifle. He didn't even grip it tight. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "Yes," the man replied, "but not just tonight. We've been coming a long time." More riders stepped forward now, their torches lighting up the field like a procession. Among them, Thomas recognized a few faces, men who used to work on farms before the war. Women he'd seen gathering herbs on the edge of town. Children born in freedom but carrying the weight of their parents' chains. "We heard what you did," the man said. "What you didn't do, you didn't buy her. Didn't take part in that evil. Not many men say no when they think nobody will care." "I said no," Thomas replied, "but I didn't help her either." The man's eyes softened. Sometimes saying no is help. Sometimes refusing to join the wrong side is the first stone. In a bridge, from behind him, a woman stepped forward with a young child in her arms. The linen bundle from earlier. The same child, the infant girl from the auction block. "We got her out," the woman said gently. "Didn't leave her behind. Thought you ought to know." Thomas stared at the girl. Her eyes were closed now, tiny fists curled under her chin. She looked like peace itself. "We don't want trouble," the man continued. "We came to say thank you, and to ask, ... What kind of man are you, Mr. Rourke? Because whether you like it or not, others are watching now." The wind rustled through the trees behind the house. The prairie was holding its breath. Thomas looked at the crowd before him, free men and women who had suffered, survived, and still believed in standing for what was right, and in that moment, he realized that silence would no longer be enough. Thomas Rourke had never felt smaller in his own boots. Not during the war, not when he came home to find his family buried, not even in the long, aching years of silence on the ranch. But standing there now, rifle forgotten in his hand, staring into the flickering torchlight, reflecting in 50 pairs of weary, unblinking eyes, he felt as if the ground might swallow him whole. He was no preacher, no hero, just a man trying to disappear. Yet somehow, his silence had spoken. And now people had come expecting more. The older man at the front stepped aside, gently gesturing for the woman holding the baby to come forward. The infant stirred, her small limbs shifting under the blanket. In the dim light, Thomas could see a mark on her cheek, just a faint bruise, but fresh. His stomach turned. "She didn't cry when we pulled her away," the woman said softly. "Didn't even blink. That kind of silence. It don't come natural. It's taught by fear." Thomas's throat tightened. He took a slow breath and stepped closer. The woman held the child out to him, not demanding, not assuming, just offering. As if placing a question in his hands, he looked down at the tiny girl. Her face, round and soft, held no judgment, no blame. Just quiet, exhausted trust. A trust he hadn't earned. "I ain't fit to care for a child," he said. voice rough as gravel. I couldn't even protect my own. You didn't fail. Your daughter, the woman replied gently. Fate took her. But this one, she's here, right now. And the Lord has a habit of bringing things back around, when hearts are ready. The older man stepped forward again. We didn't come here to burden you, he said. We came because someone saw what you did. A girl in town, she followed you, told us everything. And we figured, maybe it meant something. Thomas turned away for a moment, looking toward the horizon. Dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky, just a faint lavender streak along the edge of the world. The shadows were thinning, but the weight on his shoulders only grew heavier. I thought of the girl on the auction block, her ribs pressing through her skin, her eyes unblinking. He thought of the townspeople, turning away with their mouths full of excuses, and he thought of all the times he had done the same. All the times he told himself that not being cruel was enough. But what if it wasn't? What if decency required action, not just refusal? He turned back to the group. You came all this way. What do you want from me? A younger man in the back called out, we want to know what side you're on. That silenced everything. Not north or south. Not blue or gray. Not even black or white. Just right. Or wrong. Thomas looked at the baby again. Then at the men and women who had carried her to his door, not in anger, but in hope. He'd never asked for this moment, but here it was. And whatever happened next would tell the truth about the kind of man he'd become. He stepped forward, slowly, and reached out his arms. The woman placed the child in them without a word. The warmth of her body startled him. Her tiny breath pressed against his chest like a heartbeat trying to remember it was safe. Thomas looked down at her and felt something shifts, something unfamiliar and ancient, as if the soil beneath his feet had changed its shape. I'll feed her, he said quietly. Shelter her, keep her safe. A murmur passed through the crowd, approval, gratitude, maybe even relief. The woman who'd carried the baby nodded with tears in her eyes. The older man smiled, slow and solemn. That's all any of us can ask, he said, to stand for one who can't stand for themselves. The sun crested the hills, casting a warm gold light over the ranch. For the first time in years, Thomas Rourke didn't look away from it. The sun, fully risen now, poured soft amber light across the open fields and settled on the gathered crowd like a quiet blessing. For a long time, no one spoke. The moment hung in the morning air, fragile, profound. Thomas stood still, the infant, resting against his chest, her breathing slow and steady. Her tiny hand gripped the collar of his shirt with surprising strength, as if she already understood that the world was not a safe place and that this man, this stranger, was her only anchor. It was a strange thing, to be seen by so many eyes, and yet feel something deeper stirring inside a reckoning, not just for himself but for the land around him. His decision had been simple in the moment. Take the child, care for her, protect her, but now that choice rippled outward, brushing against everyone who had come. The older man who had first spoken stepped forward again. Her name is Ruth, he said gently. We gave it to her last night. After the story of the woman who refused to turn her back, even when she had every reason to, Ruth stayed. She chose to belong where others might not have wanted her. That baby's got that same spirit. Thomas nodded, mouth dry. Ruth, he repeated. The name felt weighty, holy. Even he shifted her gently in his arms, cradling her close. She stays. That single phrase caused a few people in the crowd to exhale quiet, barely audible sighs, as though they'd been holding their breath since long before dawn. A woman dabbed her eyes with the sleeve of her shawl. A boy no older than 12 smiled softly, his arms wrapped around his sister. I got some food inside, Thomas said. Ain't much, but you're welcome to it. A murmur of thanks passed through the group, but no one moved just yet. They weren't here for food. They had come for a different kind of nourishment, hope, dignity. Something long denied, and now stirring at the edge of the world. You'll need help, the older man said after a moment. Babies don't raise themselves, especially ones who come into this world already marked. Thomas nodded slowly. I've raised cattle, fixed fences, dug wells. Never raised a child. Well, the man said, a quiet smile breaking across his weathered face. You're about to learn, and you won't be learning alone. One by one, they began to step forward, first the women, then the men, offering hands, advice, food, old cloth, stories. They brought with them more than just supplies, they brought skills, passed down from generations of surviving what no one should have had to endure. How to swaddle a baby with one torn sheet. How to treat fevers with bark and vinegar. How to sing songs so old that even sorrow forgot their origins. Someone fixed a pot of coffee on the stove inside Thomas's cabin. A girl mended a hole in his roof using a patch of leather. An elderly woman swept the front porch with a broom she had brought on her saddle, humming all the while. Children played near the barn, laughing as they discovered that the chickens had names Thomas had long ago given them when he was too lonely to speak to anything else. By midday, his ranch was alive again, not with noise, but with meaning. People didn't ask for permission. They simply moved with purpose, as if reclaiming a part of something stolen long ago. Thomas watched from the edge of the porch. Ruth now swaddled and sleeping in a basket near the door. He felt a strange pull in his chestnut pain, but something adjacent to it. Maybe it was healing. Maybe it was redemption. He realized he had spent years tending to land and livestock, keeping himself sealed from anything that might stir the grief buried deep within. But now, that grief had broken open not to drown him, but to let new roots grow. "You think this'll last?" he asked the older man beside him. The man looked around at the people fixing fences, boiling water, laughing gently. "Nothing ever lasts on its own," he said, "but if we keep showing up, if we build it together, it just might." Thomas Rourke, once a silent witness to the suffering of others, now stood at the center of a story still being written. Not with speeches or rifles, but with kindness. And a promise, whispered quietly to a sleeping child. "You are safe here. You are wanted." The following morning, word reached Rose Hill. It came in fragments, passed between store clerks and stable hands, whispered across quilting circles and saloons. First, it was the girl Ruth who had disappeared from the auction. Then it was the tale of torchlight seen heading west, toward the old Rourke ranch. And finally, as the sun rose on the town's sleepy dirt streets, someone swore they had seen 50 freed slaves gathered outside Thomas Rourke's gate, welcomed, not driven away. By mid-morning, the townspeople could hardly focus on their chores. Speculation buzzed in the air like summer gnats. In the general store, Mr. Wilkins, the grocer, leaned over his counter, whispering to a customer. "They say he took the baby in, held her like she was his own kin." In the churchyard, Mrs. Esterburn, whose husband once led the local slave patrol, clucked her tongue and declared, "That man's gone soft in the head, taking on trouble like that." But others were quiet, thoughtful. On the back corner of the livery, young Emmett Carter, a boy barely old enough to grow whiskers, remembered how Thomas once helped his PA rebuild their barn after a fire, without asking for a coin in return. He stared toward the hills where Rourke's ranch sat and wondered if decency was making its way back into the world, one stubborn act at a time. The sheriff, a thick-set man named Harrelson, was not so calm. He stood in his office chewing the end of a cigar that had long since gone out, a furrow carved deep between his eyes. "You tellin' me Rourke brought them here?" he asked the deputy, who nodded. "Didn't bring him," the deputy replied. "But he didn't turn him away neither. And the girl, she's with him. Baby's still breathin', too." Harrelson spat on the floor. "This ain't gonna sit right. Not with the voters. Not with the council. Man harbors runaways, takes in abandoned colored infants. It's asking for chaos." But chaos didn't come. What came instead was silence, a quiet refusal from the town to act, a stillness rooted not in agreement, but in uncertainty. After all, no law had been broken. The baby was unwanted by her seller. Rourke was a free man. And though the town's spine still bent toward old habits, something about this story unsettled them, not like fear, but like guilt. 3 days passed. Then a week. No one rode out to Rourke's ranch, not to protest, not to punish. But the whispers grew. "Did you hear they're helping fix up the place? I heard the baby laughed first time since the auction. They're growing vegetables. Rebuilt his barn door, too." Still, there were threats. A note nailed to the church's front door. "White blood belongs with white hands." Another etched in coal on the tavern wall. "That baby's got no place here." But none dared ride out, because something about Thomas Rourke scared them now, not because he was violent, but because he was certain. And certainty, rooted in quiet conviction, is harder to move than men with guns. He didn't speak of his decision. He didn't come into town to boast or defend. He simply stayed on his land, tending to his crops and his fences. And Ruth, by now, she had begun to crawl, her laughter echoing down the porch steps and across the pasture. Women from the group came regularly to help. One taught Thomas how to make broth from bones. Another showed him how to boil laundry with soap. They didn't ask for thanks. They came because the child mattered, and because Thomas had said yes when the rest of the world had said nothing. At night, under a roof patched by many hands, he would sit beside Ruth as she slept and feel the ache in his chest ease. Slowly. He wasn't trying to fix history. He was just trying to write one new chapter. Back in Rose Hill, people talked. Some disapproved. Others wondered quietly if maybe the past didn't have to shape everything. And in every whisper, whether angry or awed, the name Thomas Rourke took on a new weight. Not as the loner who lived past the creek, but as the man who chose to stand, while everyone else sat still. Seasons turned. The grass grew long and gold across the plains, and the sharp winds of winter softened into the hush of spring. Life on the Rourke ranch settled into a rhythm, not always easy, but real. The kind of life where laughter came slowly, like thawing rivers, but stayed when it arrived. Little Ruth grew faster than Thomas expected. Her legs wobbled through her first steps in front of the chicken coop, and she called him Pa before he ever felt worthy of the name. She had hair like spun cotton and eyes full of old soul, like she'd already seen too much and chosen to trust anyway. It broke him in ways he didn't know he could still break. By then, the ranch had changed. It no longer looked like the lonely stretch of dust and wood it once had. A small vegetable garden grew near the porch, tomatoes, onions, squash, all thriving under the care of women who still came every week. A rough-hewn swing had been built under the old oak tree, where Ruth would sit with a doll sewn from flour sacks and sing to herself in a voice that floated like wind through tall grass. But something else had changed too. The people of Rose Hill, those who had once spoken with suspicion or silence, began to soften. Slowly, a widow who had lost her only child brought hand-me-down dresses for Ruth. A young couple, ashamed of their family's past, offered seeds from their harvest. Even Mr. Wilkins, the grocer who had once refused to sell sugar to freedmen, now kept a sack of it behind the counter marked for Ruth. It wasn't transformation, not yet, but it was a beginning. Still, there were nights when Thomas sat on the porch long after Ruth was asleep, his rifle leaning beside him, not out of fear but memory. He'd seen too much to believe. Peace came easy. The ghost of his daughter lingered in the corners of the house, not in sadness, but like a guardian. And sometimes, when Ruth laughed, it sounded like her. He wondered what his wife would have thought if she'd lived to see him cradle a child that half the county thought he shouldn't have touched. He liked to think she would have smiled. She always had more courage than he did. One evening, long after the harvest, a knock came at his gate. It was not angry, not urgent, just firm. He opened the gate to find a small group standing there, 3 black men, middle-aged, well-dressed, and a little nervous. One held a letter, another, a worn book. The third, nothing but a hat pressed to his chest. "You Thomas Rourke?" The one with the letter asked. "I am," he said. "We came from Wilmington," he said. "Heard about what you did." Thomas didn't speak. "We're starting a school," the man continued, "for children like Ruth, children who need more than shelter. They need knowledge, dignity, a future." He handed Thomas the letter. "We want you to help us find land. Write to other ranchers. Tell your story. Some will slam the door, but some might open it." Thomas looked down at the letter, his name written neatly across the top. He looked past the men, toward the light inside his home, where Ruth's shadow danced on the curtain. "I'm no speaker," he said. "Doesn't matter," the third man replied. "You're a father. That's louder than any sermon." And, for the first time since that baby was placed in his arms, Thomas understood. He hadn't been chosen to save her, she had been sent to save him, to pull him back from the edge of silence, to remind him that decency, when acted upon, becomes something holy. He looked at the men and nodded. "Let's sit. I've got coffee on. We'll talk." As they stepped inside, the wind stirred the tall grass, and the ranch seemed to hum with life. The ghosts of pain hadn't vanished, but they had been joined by new voices, of laughter, of learning, of change. Years later, when people told Ruth the story of how she came to the ranch, how her father stood at the gate with a baby in his arms while the world watched and judged, she would smile and say simply, "He didn't save me. We saved each other."